Hey everyone, welcome to SingularityComputers Client Build 5 Part 7, and this system is called Nighthawk. As I've mentioned previously, the client has requested a factory overclock for this system. So I'm going to start the video by taking you through the overclocking settings that I'm going to be using. I'm then going to move on to the performance and temperature results, and after that I'm going to give you a good look around the finished product. Before I move on to the overclocking, I'd just like to answer a question that came up a number of times on the previous video. This is something that I'm going to do from now on in my build logs. I had a number of people who thought that the tubing looks yellow, so I'm just going to clear this up. Now, the water blocks, the bits power crystal link and the reservoir accurately show the color of the coolant because they are completely transparent. The tubing does actually have a very slight color tinge to it, and this is a common problem with a lot of tubing. You know, it really doesn't matter which tubing I use, I'm going to run into this problem. It might not end up being this exact color. There is almost no tubing out there that actually accurately shows the color of coolant. You know, certainly not as accurately as bits power crystal link, for example. And I know people might argue this, but normally it is completely unnoticeable. With all other coolant colors, you would not notice it. It's just because I am using pure white coolant that it becomes really obvious. And then mixed with the fact that the lighting that I'm using is also pure white, very close to the color of the coolant, then my camera just picks it up and exaggerates it. So I'm now going to try to prove what I'm talking about. To the naked eye, it's really not a problem. I mean, it's almost unnoticeable. Basically, to the naked eye, the tubing looks a cream or off-white color, whereas the coolant, you know, through the water blocks, crystal link and reservoir looks pure white, like milk, as I've had so many people say in the comments. So I've turned off my white lighting, my filming lights, but I'm still getting the white lighting from in the build, so it still, you know, will be a bit noticeable. But right there, right now, the camera is actually accurately showing the color of the coolant through the tubing. So that is what it's really like, guys, and that doesn't look yellow or green. It just has a, you know, it looks cream or off-white. So hopefully now from that you can see what I mean. And then this tube, the camera seems to show fairly accurately as well. So there we go. Hopefully that's cleared it up. Okay, I'm now in the Extreme Tweaker section of the Rampage for Extreme UEFI, and I'm just entering my initial rough overclocking settings for Nighthawk. This is the very beginning of the process of overclocking. After this, I move on to stability testing to test the settings, and after a lot of stability testing and continuing to tweak the settings, I can finalize the settings, find stable settings for the overclock that I want. So don't use these settings as a template. This is not a guide. I do have an X79 overclocking guide coming up soon on my channel. I'm not going to go into much detail. So here you can see I've left the base clock at 100 megahertz, it's default. And I've just changed the CPU multiplier, and that's because this is how this platform is designed. A lot of people are still stuck with the ideas from the X58 platform. With the X58 platform, you could overclock the base clock massively and, you know, still have stability. So even with CPUs without unlocked multipliers, you could still do some incredible overclocks. You can see here I've changed the memory timings to 911 10 27. So I'm actually setting the memory to its XMP profile. You might have seen up the top there, I had the memory at 2133 megahertz, and I'm actually taking the CPU to 4.8 gigahertz. So you can see there I've set the CPU voltage to 1.45 volts as a starting voltage. The rest of the voltages, besides a couple of them, I'm just setting to their defaults. And you can see there the VTT, the second VTT, I've set them to their defaults because the motherboard might increase those voltages, you know, because I'm overclocking. That's what happens often when you overclock. There's automatic settings that the BIOS puts in, and they're usually a lot more than is actually needed. So to keep the temperatures down as much as possible, you need to run the lowest possible voltages for the highest possible overclock. So by manually setting some of the voltages that you don't really need to overclock, you can avoid a lot of heat. I've set the VCCSA to 1.3 volts, and you can see I've set the memory to 1.5 on both channels because that's the XMP profile. PLL 1.8 default, 1.1 volts for the PCH, which is its default. Same with the VTT DDR, that's actually half the voltage of the memory, which is 1.5 volts. And I've also disabled both of the spread spectrums. Now, in the past, for example, with the X58 platform, this was the only section of the BIOS that you really had to worry about. The only settings that you really had to worry about were, you know, the frequencies, the voltages, maybe the memory timings as well. But with these new platforms, also socket 1155 and socket 2011 is what I'm talking about. The power control settings have become really important. So with the Asus motherboards, DigiPlus power control, they have really allowed a lot of customization for the power delivery. So as you can see, I've set CPU LLC to medium, load line calibration. This is good for most overclocking up to 4.8 gigahertz. 180% on the current capability is good for all overclocking because this is the maximum. I've set the vCore MOS voltage to 7 volts. That's good for what I'm doing. I've set VCCSA LLC to high. I could really just run that at regular. VCCSA current capability to 140%, which is its maximum. The rest I've just left on automatic there. So basically the motherboard, well, we'll change it to what it needs to be for the particular settings. I've set the VTT switching frequency to 1.3 times to give cleaner power to the VTT. I've set the memory current capabilities to 120% on both channels just to give a little bit more power because I'm using 2133 megahertz memory. So that's it. That's my initial rough settings. So I would have liked to have gone into a little bit more detail, but that is exactly what I'm going to be doing coming up soon in my overclocking guide. I'm actually going to be doing 2 overclocking guides for socket 2011, a beginner's overclocking guide and also a more advanced overclocking guide. Foresight tells me that I'm going to get people commenting on the risks of overclocking, you know, talking about the risks I'm taking with overclocking a client system. Now, obviously I make my clients aware of this risk, but above that, I still provide the same warranty whether I overclock the system or not. You still have the manufacturer warranties. I also go for the Intel overclocking warranty. But I wouldn't be doing this unless I was, you know, fully confident. I've had a lot of experience overclocking and a lot of positive experience. And if overclocking is done right, it doesn't have to be dangerous. Most of the damage caused to components from overclocking is caused from components overheating. So obviously you can get around this by improving your cooling system, by monitoring your temperatures and setting fail-safes. I'm going to talk more about this in the overclocking guide also. Okay, it's now time for me to move on to the performance and temperature results. I'm going to start with the temperature results, but before I can do this, I need to talk about the overclocks that I've achieved for this system. You'll probably notice that the system is a bit loud at the moment because I'm actually currently doing some testing and I have all of the fans turned up on the 560mm radiator. You also might have noticed that I've installed all of the LEDs into the water blocks, so I replaced the faulty LEDs. And the system is completely finished at this point. I've also installed the SSD around the back of the system, but I'm not going to give you a look around the finished product until the end of the video. Okay, so the overclocks that I've achieved for this system. Now the client requested that I overclock the system to the maximum, but there's a big difference between a maximum overclock and a 24/7 stable maximum overclock. So the overclock that I've achieved on the CPU is 4.6 gigahertz. Now this CPU could have handled a lot more. I think it could have handled 5 gigahertz, but at 4.8 gigahertz the CPU needed more than 1.45 volts. And I certainly didn't want to run more than 1.45 volts for 24/7 use, because I mean this system has to run for years 24/7 stable without a problem. The overclock needs to be rock solid stable, and I've already talked about my testing and validation process. You guys know how strict that is. Now not only did I need more than 1.45 volts at 4.8 gigahertz, I needed to increase all of the power delivery settings, to their maximum, and adjust a lot of the other voltages also. Now at 4.6 gigahertz, the CPU needs 1.4 volts, which is still, fairly high, but all of the other voltages I've been able to turn down. I've been able to relax the power delivery settings a fair bit. The final overclocking settings on the CPU is 4.6 gigahertz, 1.4 volts. And I have the memory running at its XMP profile at 2133 megahertz, 9111027, 1.5 volts. Now, the graphics cards. So I was amazed at what these graphics cards could handle. Seriously, I think these things could handle 1 gigahertz on the cores. What you have to consider is that this is a quad GPU configuration. So basically, the more GPUs you have, the harder it becomes to overclock the graphics cards, the more unstable they become. So the other thing to consider is that these are dual GPU graphics cards, and normally that also limits the overclock because the power delivery on dual GPU graphics cards is not as good as a single GPU graphics card most of the time. But with the unlocked BIOSes on the 6990s, the power delivery is amazing. So yeah, I've been shocked at what these things can do. I had them up over 950 megahertz on the core, and they were still stable with minimal voltage increase. But again, this needs to be a 24/7 stable overclock for years of gaming, etc. So I have backed them off to a safe overclock of 930 megahertz without any voltage increase whatsoever. Now I did increase the power capability to plus 20%, which is the maximum. So the final overclock for the GPUs is 930 megahertz on the core at the stock voltage of the unlocked BIOS. Okay, now it's time for me to go through the temperature results. So I'm going to do things a little bit differently from now on, and I'm going to read you the results. This is a lot quicker than the way I used to do things, and it also allows me to properly compare the results. Now, you need to consider that for all of this testing, my ambient temperature is 28 degrees Celsius. The ambient temperature directly affects the temperatures of the components. So if you are going to accurately compare temperatures, you need to do the math. This has confused a lot of people in the past on my channel. Because I live in one of the hottest and most humid parts of Australia, my temperatures are sometimes a little bit warmer than other people. I can say that all of the big tech channels that do this kind of testing have ambient temperatures of around 20 degrees, whereas mine is most of the time actually up over 30 degrees Celsius. It's a cooler time of the year here at the moment, that's why they're down at 28 degrees Celsius. The other things to consider is that to simplify the results, I've calculated an average of the CPU cores and also of the 4 GPUs to give single temperature results. And also at stock clocks I had the 6990s on their unlocked BIOSes, and also I have already mentioned the overclocking settings that I used. Okay, so first of all, the system idle test. For this test I cold boot the system and let it idle for 1 hour. So first at stock clocks the CPU was 34 degrees Celsius, and so this is only 6 degrees above ambient. You need to consider that. The GPUs were 37 degrees Celsius. Overclocked, the CPU was 38 degrees Celsius, so this is only 4 degrees higher than at stock clocks, and the GPU was 38 degrees Celsius, which is only 1 degree higher than at stock clocks. So for the system idle test, the motherboard was 33 degrees Celsius and the PCH was 35 degrees Celsius. You need to consider the architecture of this platform. The motherboard and the PCH don't really get that hot because most of the activity happens on board the CPU, because that's where the memory controller is. And anyway, I'm not going to go into that now. Next up, the CPU and GPU load tests. For the CPU load test, I run Prime 95 small FFTs for 1 hour. Small FFTs creates more CPU heat because it keeps all of the activity on board the CPU instead of offloading some of it into the memory. For the GPU load test, I run the Unigen Heaven benchmark for 1 hour, and it's version 3. I use the Unigen Heaven benchmark because it seems to create more heat than anything else. Now, the CPU reached 58 degrees Celsius and the GPUs reached 53 degrees Celsius. Now, overclocked, the CPU reached 69 degrees Celsius, which is 11 degrees hotter than at stock clocks, and the GPU reached 57 degrees Celsius, which is 4 degrees hotter than its stock clocks. Now, the hottest that I saw the motherboard and PCH get was 42 degrees Celsius on the motherboard and 50 degrees Celsius on the PCH, and it was after 1 hour of the Unigen Heaven benchmark. So certainly some incredible results there. I mean, if you look at the differences in temperatures between stock clocks and the overclocking settings that I was using, you can really see how effective this water cooling system is. Mainly considering the CPU overclock was an overclock of nearly 40%, and the overclocks on the GPUs were certainly substantial considering that this is a quad GPU configuration. During the testing, the water cooling system was transferring so much heat away from the components that it was actually heating up my entire house. This quad GPU configuration dumps an incredible amount of heat. If you guys remember earlier in the build log when I was testing these graphics cards with the stock coolers on them, they were reaching nearly 90 degrees Celsius, and that wasn't even using the unlocked BIOSes. So you can just imagine how much more heat they're putting out when they're overclocked using the unlocked BIOSes. I mean, seriously, if I was still using the stock coolers at this overclock with this ambient temperature, at a rough estimate, the GPUs would be getting up over 110 degrees Celsius. So anyway, just to give you an idea of what a water cooling system is capable of. Okay, now it's time for me to go through all of the performance results. These are going to be in screenshots, and I'm going to show you the results at stock clocks and also the overclock so that you can compare the two. Okay, again, some amazing results. I'm sure you saw the substantial performance difference between stock clocks and the overclock. I actually found a sweet spot because I did have the CPU at 4.8 GHz and the GPU's up over 950 MHz on the cores, and it didn't actually make a lot of difference. The performance of the HyperX RAID 0 configuration is just incredible. You could see in Atto the reads and writes were up over 1000 megabytes per second. So I'm really happy with these overclocking settings. They are rock solid stable. They've been through all of the testing and validation without a problem. The temperatures at these settings are excellent, and as I said, it's a sweet spot for performance. I just thought I'd add what would take the performance to the absolute maximum in this build would be some latest generation graphics cards. I mean, the performance of this quad GPU dual 6990 configuration is absolutely incredible, but there's not many applications that can properly take advantage of 4 GPUs. So a few 7970s or GTX 680s would vastly increase the performance in this build. For those of you that haven't watched the previous videos in the build log, the 6990s actually came from the client's old build. Originally we were planning on installing a lot more parts from the old build, but it ends up now it is just the 6990s and the optical drive. The client has full intentions of upgrading the graphics cards, and this system will actually be coming back to me within the next couple of years for upgrades. Okay, it's now time for the final look around the system. I'm going to try to keep this as quick as possible because I have already talked a lot about the build and you have seen a lot of the build also. But the build is now completely finished and ready for shipping. As I said, I've replaced all of the LEDs and I've also now installed the third SSD, which I'll show you around the back of the build shortly. So you can see the 6 LEDs. There is 2 in each of the memory water blocks and 2 in the CPU water block. And I'm really happy with the lighting, you know, the finished product. I think the lighting is perfect. I think you can see what I meant now when I said, you know, about creating contrast in your build with your lighting. Instead of just flooding the build with light and, you know, drowning out of all of your components, use the lighting to complement your components and light up the, you know, the main features. So the LEDs have completely lit up the heart of the build, and yeah, I'm really happy with the finished result, with the way it looks, because I think the Bits Power Crystal Link and all of those water blocks on the motherboard is really what sets this build apart and makes it individual. From very early on I knew that I was going to be using a lot of water blocks in close vicinity, and I had the choices of tubing or Bits Power Crystal Link, but I was more inclined towards Bits Power Crystal Link. Once I installed the water blocks and saw the aesthetics, I could just imagine, you know, what Bits Power Crystal Link was going to look like. So there is really no question about it. And I'm really happy that I went with black sparkle fittings. I think it just suits the build perfectly. I did want a little bit more silver in the build because there is silver in the water blocks due to the nickel plating. So yeah, I just wanted some more silver accents. So the fittings do that perfectly. And then, you know, the black in the fittings, the black sparkle goes with the color scheme of black and white. So I think it was a good choice. You know, black fittings would have been the obvious choice, but there is already enough black in the build. I think there's a good balance between black and white, mainly now that all the lighting is installed. You can see that the lighting, because the coolant is such a pure white, it reflects a lot of light, you know, an incredible amount of light compared to the surroundings, because the surroundings are mostly black, you know, almost all black. So it gives the coolant a kind of glow in the dark effect. You can see it particularly with the reservoir, because that's, you know, the place where the most coolant is. And you can see how I've lit up the reservoir. It's something you should always do because it's a great way to show off your coolant. You know, it really shows off the Mayhem's coolant perfectly. I'd just like to also mention quickly a number of the components that have really made this build what it is, and they're components that I use in all of my builds. Bits Power Fittings and EK water blocks, and also the Mayhem's coolant, which I haven't actually used for a while, but I'm really happy that I used it in this build because it just looks incredible. Just a quick look at the wiring. I think the Corsair individually sleeved black cable kit for the AX1200 suits this build really well. This is the only place that you can actually see the wiring once the side panel is on. You can easily see the 4 8-pin PCIe going into the graphics cards, but other than that, the rest of the wiring just kind of fades into the background. So just taking a look at the LEDs there. The LEDs I used are 3mm Mod Smart LEDs, and I actually sleeved all of the wiring for them. I'll give you a better look at the sleeving when we take a look around the back of the build. I'm glad I put that heat shrink on those front panel connectors because you can see that through the side panel windows. And I also sleeved the SATA data cables because I knew they would be in sight from the front of the build also. I'm also really happy with the way I mounted the reservoir and dual pumps, because those dual pumps can take up a lot of space in a build, but they're hidden away there nicely. Also, the mounts are incredibly sturdy. I mean, the resin pumps are going nowhere in a hurry, and the placement of the reservoir balances out the build nicely. Now up here I had to change around the wiring for the optical drive because I had to use the SATA power from the optical drive on the third SSD. So this is a Bitfinex Alchemy extension cable that actually comes off the end of the wiring for the 2 LED strips. I also really like these Silverstone filters. Not only are they highly effective and, you know, save a lot of maintenance, they suit the build really well. Once the side panels are on, you can just see them through the side panels, and you can also see the fan blades through them and through the side panels. Okay, that's about everything around this side of the build. I'm going to give you another look with the side panels on, but now it's time for a look around the back of the build. So you can see I've installed the third SSD, the Intel 520 series 240GB SSD, and I've cleaned up the wiring here. So that's just on its own for extra data storage. I have the operating system on the 2 Kingston HyperX 240GB SSDs, which are in RAID 0. So I'm really happy with the way that I managed to get this cable management. I think it's really clean considering how challenging it is to manage the cables for the SSDs. Because they're mounted so close to the end of this panel, you can't really hide much of the wiring behind this panel. I mean, you certainly can't run the data cables up here. That's why I had to run them across this gap, which I really didn't want to, because you can actually see this gap from the front of the build. So you can see the top one here I have just running straight across to here, and I could have actually stuck on one of the cable tie clips here, but it just would have looked messy, so I decided to leave it attached to nothing. But because of the way that I've bent it in a position, it's not going anywhere. I mean, you've got to give that a good push to move it, so I'm really happy with how clean that looks. That just runs straight down there. Then I've attached it to this one, and I've managed to attach it here, so, and you can see they all go through here and then plug into the motherboard. Now, because I swapped the LEDs around, I was able to clean up this wiring here a bit. You might be able to notice that there's a lot less wiring there than there was before. So this is all of the LED wiring here. So these are the ones that I sleeved. And you can see them all going up here and then into there. So that's all of the wiring around the back of the build. I've already shown you most of it. And yeah, nothing's changed down here. This is exactly the same as it was previously. All I've done, as you can probably notice, is I've installed a cap on the end of the tap here. I had a lot of people tell me to do that. I had full intentions of doing that before I shipped the system, just in case the tap leaks. So that is everything. That is what the completed system looks like from around the back of the build. Okay, the side panels are on, and it's now time for the final look around the outside of the system. Tomorrow morning I'm going to pack the system up ready for shipping. I was actually intending to show you some of the packing process, but I did this in Client Build 4, so if you want to see how I pack up my systems ready for shipping, check out the Client Build 4 build log. With this system, I've just run out of time. From now onwards, I just want to focus on the packing because I spend a lot of time doing it. I'm extremely fussy. So you can see how the side panel window is really well placed in this case. I mean, you can see just the part of the build that you really want to see. You've got the heart of the build there. You can see the graphics cards and the graphics card water blocks, and you can also just see the side of the res. I think it's perfect window placement. And you can see what I mean about the cables also. You can hardly see any cables. So just looking at the fans and filters through the ventilation in the side panel, I think it looks great how you can just see the filters but also the fan blades. And now for a look up the front of the build and over the top of the build. It looks great all put together. It's nice to finally see the finished product because this has been a long build for me. Like, I've spent a lot of time building this system compared to what I usually do. It's been fairly involved, and I've spent a lot more time on the build log than I normally do, than I have in the past. Believe it or not, the build log takes probably 4 times the amount of time than the actual build, so very time consuming. Just taking a look there at how the cables come out through the back. That top panel cover has so much ventilation in it. You can see how not only does it have ventilation right across the top, but it also has ventilation in the sides. So now for a look around the back. The entire back panel is obviously blank except for the ducts and ventilation. So you can see the Corsair AX1200 through the ventilation, as well as the cables and radiator. I really like the look of the radiator with the grills. I think that looks great, and I mean the cables just kind of blend in and you can see the big gaps between them. Okay, I'll just say finally that I've had a lot of fun building this system and I'm really happy with the finished product overall. That sums up this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and favorite if you want to see more.